Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Johannes Oljelund, Director General of the International Development Cooperation, Ministry for Foreign Affairs, Sweden.
Very welcome to this discussion on shared commitments, operationalizing multilateral action for peace and development. It's good, isn't it? It's great. I know it's been said before this week, but it's fantastic that we can continue this discussion, even though it has to be done digitally. Or maybe even with the advantage of it being done digitally, because I've heard that we have a great participation during this week, that we have a fantastic audience, and that we have also been able to do it interactively and together. So very much looking forward to the discussion today. We live, of course, in a very challenging time. As we're talking about peace and development, that could be said almost every year, at every forum, because we are engaging in fragile and conflict-ridden countries and situations. So times are difficult. But of course, this year it's compounded by COVID-19 and by the effects of that. That makes it all the more important that we can have this discussion and that we can find ways forward. It also offers, in a sense, an opportunity. We know that to get out of this and to move away from the consequences of this crisis, we're going to have to invest. We're going to have to find ways of building back better or coming back stronger. And that gives us sort of an opportunity. But also a requirement for us to discuss how do we do that. And that's in the very title of today's discussion. It's on shared commitments, operationalizing multilateral action for peace and development. So we'll try to focus on operationalizing and action in today's discussion. With that, I will have the chance to introduce a fantastic panel. A panel that consists, and I'll name them all, but that consists of knowledge from the multilateral arena, from nationhood, from sister organizations to CIPRI or to the Stockholm Forum to this week, forums. This discussion that is taking place globally. So I think we will have a fantastic discussion today. All right. Digitally with me, we have first, Oscar Fernandez-Taranco, Assistant Secretary General for the Peacebuilding Support in the Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs. Great to have you here, Oscar. And second, we have Franck Bousquet, Senior Director for the World Bank's work on fragility, conflict, and violence. Great to see you there. And third, we have Ambassador Annika Söder, my former boss in many different roles, former State Secretary of Sweden, and now a member of the Eminent persons of the UN Peacebuilding Review, or Peacebuilding Architecture Review, to give the full. Fourth, we have Ashraf Swelam, forgive my pronunciation if it's wrong, and correct me, Director General of the Cairo International Center for Conflict Resolution, Peacekeeping and Peacebuilding, and also head of the Secretariat of the Aswan Forum. And finally, Ebba Colando, spokesperson to the chairperson of the African Union, and also board member of the Tana Forum. So very welcome, all of you. What a fantastic panel. What knowledge we have amassed, and I see great opportunity for a good discussion. And before I set the panelists off, I also want to say that this is an interactive forum, as it has been all week, and there is we're hoping for participation by the audience, and there is the possibility to send us questions that we can that I have been given the technical support to be able to raise with the panelists. So let's let's make it as interactive as we can. So, Oscar, I will start with you. The Sustaining Peace resolutions that passed simultaneously in the General Assembly and the Security Council in 2016 offer an agreed framework for greater investment and international cooperation in support of peace-building efforts. That's the framework. But now we're 15 years into the foundation of the UN peacebuilding architecture. Many countries from Burkina to Lebanon and Sudan are seeking increased UN assistance, resources and knowledge in efforts to sustain peace. And now we are in a period of review of the architecture. And what would you like to see come out of it? What's your hope and aspirations for the review?
Well, before getting started, and I hope you're hearing me well, let me just thank you, Johannes, and all my co-fellow panelists. This is a great opportunity to interact at a crucial crossroads of multilateralism and relevance of many of our institutions, and particularly as it relates to shared commitments. Let me also thank CIPRI and the Swedish government, actually, for putting together this very impressive forum. What we hope to get out of this review is a refocusing. I mean, what we want out of this review is to see how much progress we have had since the 2016 Sustaining Peace resolution was passed, which actually was a paradigmic shift in the thinking of how we do peace building and prevention, and in a way to see how we can strengthen the elements of the multilateral system, how we can support national visions of peace building, how we can infuse inclusivity, how we can address many of the drivers of fragility and instability that we see in many conflict and fragile states. So the review should be in going forward. So that as a way just to capture, I know we'll have the opportunity several times. Thank you, Johannes.
Thank you very much. That set us off. So turning to you, Franck, the World Bank has just, or very recently, released its first Fragility, conflict and violence strategy. It's been an integrated part of the discussion here this week. I heard a really good discussion on it yesterday. And this comes sort of a decade after the World Development Report 2011, when conflict and security, or conflict, security and development, and came up as the topic, and now with the Pathways for Peace report from 2018. And what we have seen is, of course, the bank growing as an investor, as a source of finance, and also as a source of knowledge, not least led by yourself in the bank. So I want to give you, or hoping to hear from you, a bit of your perspective on what you've learned in what I think is a pretty sort of a rapid change within the bank.
Well, thank you, Johannes. And again, like Oscar, very happy to be part of this fantastic panel, and very pleased to see how the CIPRI forum shows us the need to be agile and adapt to the circumstance. We're actually learning from you as we speak for our Fragility forum. So congratulations to Sweden, as always, and to the CIPRI forum organizer. So the bank, for our audience, first, why is the World Bank focusing on countries that are impacted by fragility, conflict, and violence? We are not a blue helmet, we are not a humanitarian organization, but we are focusing from a development perspective because we know that those countries are the ones that, if we do business as usual, by 2030, we'll have 2/3 of the extreme poor. So for us, if we want to succeed in our twin goal that consists in boosting shared prosperity, but also eradicating poverty, we're really scaling up our focus on those countries impacted by fragility, conflict, and violence. So that's the why. Now, we have learned a lot. I have to say, you are right, that over the past decades, the bank has progressively shifted from a focus on reconstruction, which is actually was the reason it was created as the IBRD. And as I mentioned before, France, my home countries, were actually the first client countries of the World Bank, just as part of the reconstruction of Europe following World War II, to a situation today where we are actually working, as we say, across the fragility spectrum. What does it mean? It means that we are investing also during crisis, during conflict, because it's not only a space for humanitarian actors or peace or security actors, it's also for development actors. And we have shown a lot with a joint report with Oscar, who's doing an amazing work with PBSO and the team, a joint UN World Bank report showing that $1 invested in prevention can save $16 in post-conflict. So we're working in crisis, in conflict, but also on prevention, and maybe I can come back to it. So first, a big trend, learning that it's not only focusing on the after conflict, but also working across the spectrum. We are also scaling up our engagement with many partners. How do you want to deal with refugee crisis without working with UNHCR? How do you want to work in Central African Republic without working with the peacekeeping? How do you want to work in difficult place without leveraging civil society organization, Red Cross and others? So I think the whole point that the strategy lays out is the understanding that no organization can do it alone. And I think this very much links with the holistic approach that is super important. We have learned also that we need to have more and more staff on the ground. This is not about looking from Washington what's going on. We have 800 staff that are working in countries impacted by fragility, conflict, and violence. We are also making sure that they have the right skills so that they understand that we don't design or supervise programs in those countries in the same way than in other more stable environment. And last but not least, I think we are putting financing, walking the talk. We are putting more and more financing. We got a major replenishment in Sweden in December that allows us to scale up our resource for those countries where extreme poverty is increasing. And that's something very important as part of IDA, or Fund for the Poorest. In fact, if I may, Johannes, very, very last point, it's also about not only financing, it's about trying to make sure that we have a proper understanding of the root cause of fragility. Because it's very important for development actors to help government commit and engage on those grievances that need to be tackled before it becomes too late and becomes a security or humanitarian issues. So the proper analysis at the country level, it's not from Washington, it's really at the country level, at the local level, about what's going on and how we can come from a development perspective, bring our added value. So a lot has been learned over the past few years, and we are happy now that we are moving to the operationalization of the strategy, again, building on the lesson learned not only from the bank, but many other organizations. We have consulted in more than 37 countries, including in Sweden, but also in many countries impacted by conflict and violence, to learn from their own experience about how we can be more effective on the ground. So again, thank you for being here today.
Thank you very much, Franck. Thank you. This gives me this is good, because now we've heard from the UN, we've heard from the World Bank, and now I have a chance to turn to you, Annika. You have worked on peacebuilding issues, I think, for decades. That's what I think, and you've done it in a position of authority in Sweden in running our policy, both on the development side and on the security policy side and the foreign policy side. So I think you're an excellent person to challenge you a bit to talk to us about both the UN and the World Bank. And on top of that, the Secretary General has asked you to advise him on exactly that within the framework of the review of the peacebuilding architecture. So can we get a sort of can we get some noise ahead of the report? What you will be coming out with?
We are 5 so-called independent eminent persons, and we are working on a letter to the Secretary General that we hope will make a difference. And we are conducting a lot of consultations with civil society, with the UN, with the bank, and many, many actors. And so we are also a good channel for other concerns. And I'd like to thank the UN for having a very open process here with inputs from all corners of the world. Let me say about this architecture, as it is called, that the UN model, the architecture, works well. Actually, the house is built. So the next step for the architecture is to furbish the house even better than it is furbished today, and to populate the house with the right actors so that the impact on the ground will be good. And I can say that the Peacebuilding Fund is making a difference and taking on not only rebuilding after conflict, but also prevention, which is very, very important. Maybe even more striking is that the Peacebuilding Commission, with 40 member states, that commission has become an accompaniment to countries that want to have support from other member states, from peers, to actually improve the situation in their own countries. So what it is now about is to further build on that, so that the UN and all other actors that Franck mentioned very clearly can make a contribution. So that is one. The house is there. Let's improve it. The second is the slogan, "No women, no peace." And I use that slogan to cover the importance of involving all actors in peacemaking. Way back, making peace was only with the warring parties. Now we understand that peace is about involving women, communities, local actors, youth, and to support governments that do not shy away from the entire society and that work that is necessary to build a sustaining peace. I would also like to mention mediation organizations, facilitation organizations that are very often international, but have an important role in giving voice to aspects that may not be present in headquarters in New York, Washington, or in our own capitals. Thirdly, I believe this is about sustaining peace. And here I want to make two remarks. One is on good peace-building donorship and financing. And I believe that the Peacebuilding Commission and the World Bank, regional banks, regional organizations, and the UN, and not least donors that want to contribute to overcoming fragility, could work much better together, not to, for example, give up a country when a peacekeeping mission leaves, or donors that are more interested in their own cred than in actually making an effort to line up, avoid duplication, but also find the synergies to support and avoid relapse into conflict. This is becoming more complicated now because of the pandemic, and it's exacerbating all the problems that we have. Great power rivalry, difficulties in contributing on the ground to solving conflicts, and risk of the need for more preventative action because of social unrest and other factors that can come up from the crisis that many countries will live through. So I'd like to make a pledge for good peace-building donorship, in particular when it comes to enhancing the ongoing collaboration between the World Bank and the UN and the regional financial institutions. And here, the donors that contribute to those organizations have a very important responsibility, and not to fragment their financial contributions in the times of the pandemic, but actually make good core contributions to this very important cause.
Thank you. I take it as advice as well, and it's a big house, quite challenging, quite a lot of rooms, and so a chance to continue. Ashraf, also Annika brought up the panel as being inclusive and as not only being consisting of the members of the panel, but also the conversation that you are having and the stakeholder meetings and so on. And I think that it's, you know, in the same vein, it's fantastic to have you on the panel, Ashraf. You organized the Aswan Forum in 2019, which I think was the first, but not the last. And it was you did something similar to what we are also trying to do here during the Stockholm Forum, bringing together both the civil society, political leaders, business leaders, and to have broad discussions around these issues. So, the wealth of knowledge that you have gained from the Aswan Forum, we want to be able to include that here. So my basic question is, what happened in Aswan? What are your takeaways? What do you want to give us as advice to bring into this discussion?
Thank you very much. I would like first to take a moment to thank the Swedish Ministry of Foreign Affairs, CIPRI, and the organizers of the Stockholm Forum, especially Martina Selmi and Jago Solomon, for convening this meeting during what are truly extraordinary times. Having just come out of organizing a similar event last December, I'm fully aware, believe me, of the kind of effort it takes to put an event like this together, let alone the complications of moving it online with such speed and efficiency. So congratulations. I'm also reminded of the professionalism, dedication, and hard work of my team at the Cairo Center and the support of our partners, both national and international, who made the Aswan Forum possible. Acting in its capacity as the former chairman of the African Union and as the champion of post-conflict reconstruction and development in Africa, Egypt launched the Aswan Forum for Sustainable Peace and Development last December. The forum was, in a way, a continuation of Egypt's contribution to the global discussion and the global discourse on issues of peace, security, and development, including through its mediation and peacekeeping efforts in Africa, but also its membership of the UN Security Council and the Peacebuilding Commission. The forum, in effect, was born out of a realization that despite the best of African and international efforts, 2020 will regrettably not be the year when the guns are silenced in Africa, as we all hoped, and that a milestone to realizing the aspirations of Agenda 2063, the Africa we want, has unfortunately been missed. And as such, the forum was a response to the need of African heads of states, leaders from national governments, the African Union, regional economic communities, financial institutions, the private sector, and civil society to come together with international and regional partners for an Africa-led and Africa-focused discussion on the opportunities and challenges facing Africa, to identify the shortcomings in our approach and to devise ways moving forward. The inaugural meeting was the culmination of a thorough, substantial preparatory process that lasted for more than a year, working with 18 African and global partners, including the African Union, the PBSO, the government of Sweden. It included organizing 5 workshops held between Cairo and Addis Ababa, which brought together hundreds of leading experts from Africa and around the world. Throughout this process, and irrespective of the topic of the discussion, be it the ever-evolving nature of conflict and armed groups, be it the growing nexus between terrorism and crime, or the plight of millions of Africans forcibly displaced, or the imperative of advancing the meaningful and comprehensive implementation of the Women, Peace and Security agenda, 3 key messages kept coming up in every single discussion. One, that in the face of the qualitatively different nature of today's threats and risks to peace and security and development in Africa, our toolbox is falling short, and that the continent needs a paradigm shift from managing crisis to managing risks. 2, that over the last 2 decades, and this is a little bit of a mixed bag of good and bad news, that over the last 2 decades, but specifically since 2015, this paradigm shift from crisis management to conflict prevention and sustaining peace, anchored in a vision of sustainable development, has actually been evolving, both in Africa and around the world. In other words, that Africa's problem is not the lack of normative frameworks, it's rather the lack of implementation. And 3, that no matter the nature or the amount of external support, the responsibility for charting African pathways for peace, security, and development rests first and foremost with African governments and societies. And that's actually what I would like to focus the next minute or two on. That in endorsing this paradigm shift from to prevention and to sustaining peace, Aswan was actually designed in such a way that its first port of call would be African governments and societies. In Pathways for Peace, which Franck mentioned and Oscar contributed to, the World Bank and the United Nations made it absolutely clear that the responsibility for prevention is first and foremost that of national governments and of societies. The Aswan Forum took that notion a huge step forward by highlighting in the presence of African leaders that prevention is not only a sovereign responsibility, but that it is also a sovereignty enhancer. That national ownership comes with national responsibility. Aswan acknowledged that the best way to manage the multiple and multidimensional risks that face societies and that to prevent them from descending into conflict is through building resilience, through inclusive and sustainable development. It called on a preventive lens in developing and implementing national development plans and policies anchored in the sustainable development goals. In Aswan, we agreed that the SDGs do not only provide a global, comprehensive, and indivisible agenda for human progress, but also provide the best lens to identify root causes of conflict and to see the structural vulnerabilities ailing societies and to make the targeted interventions that are needed to address them. And that while societies will never be prepared for all risks at all time, that risks-informed planning policies and implementation would allow African policymakers to prepare, to respond to crisis, and to adapt over time while retaining state structure and function. That risk-informed national planning would allow policymakers to take the idea of failure more seriously, obliging them to consider not only the likelihood of disaster, but also to make clear that the intensity of the potential adverse consequences of crisis in the case of inaction and the exposure and vulnerability of our societies. Risk-informed national planning would mean nothing if not accompanied by risk-informed budgets, which would similarly allow decision makers in national governments to manage these difficult trade-offs between the short term, the medium term, and the long term. In doing all of that, and while recognizing the indispensable role of central governments, the forum highlighted the critical role of local authorities as first responders, as the interface for delivering governance and public goods, as key to settling local conflicts. And hence the Aswan's Forum, one of the Aswan Forum's big goals was that in handing the responsibility over to local authorities, we need to bring with it the authority and the resources closer to where the problems and the opportunities exist. And then one final word, and that is about the role of local communities and the necessity of leveraging the pillars of peace and resilience that exist in our community. Aswan Forum emphasized that inclusivity is not a box-checking exercise. It's not merely a means of legitimizing processes, that no country will advance without the full participation of 70% of its population, namely women and youth, that in all aspects of life, and that in the face of certain risks, like extremism leading to terrorism, it's actually local actors, not central governments, that play the most decisive role in prevention.
Thank you very much, Ashraf. I hear. My reading is I hear very similar messages from the members of the panel so far, and which is with a strong emphasis, not least on moving to implementation and being close to the ground. I think also in practice a rather big challenge, even though we agree on the challenges or on the that needs to be the path. Turning to you, Ebba, I think also that you You spoke, Ashraf, about the move to implementation. The framework is there, but we need to move to implementation. And part of that is, of course, with the African Union, which is in a period of reform. I think all of us who work with international organizations on different levels, we seem to always be in a period of reform. But nonetheless, it's important to keep improving. And the African Union, of course, is one of those. So I would like to ask you, Ebba, to hear from you, how do you see the ongoing reforms and how do you see them contributing to advancing the efforts to sustaining peace, and perhaps as Ashraf was bringing up, how does it bring us closer to implementation?
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me, and really, I'm delighted to be part of this panel. I think one thing that is important to know about the African Union as an intergovernmental organization with 55 member states is that the current institutional and financial reform process that is currently underway at the AU is part of a continuum of very many reform processes within the organization as it moved from the African Union, from the Organization of African Unity to the African Union as it is today. But within the normative frameworks, when we start talking about shared commitments in how it pertains to operationalizing multilateral action for peace and development, I would like to talk a little bit about some of the normative frameworks that already exist within the African Union for this area of work that include the African peace and security architecture, which is not the point of departure of the AU's involvement in the multilateral and regional conflict prevention, management and resolution, of course, but it certainly forms an integral part of the AU's mandate since the inception of the architecture, and that brought about some catalytic change of the AU's involvement in peace and security from a normative, political and an operational point of view. And that's just part of sort of the historic. It's sort of a continuum of a testimony of the AU's commitment and its member states in driving the African agenda and its peace and development challenges. So, but as we talk about dialogue, and especially the dialogue that we're participating in today, which is so important, like this forum, and like my previous speaker who was talking about the Aswan forum that was established last year. The AU has long understood the importance of dialogue like this, which is why the Tana Forum, which is championed and supported by the African Union, which really is steeped on the political commitment by the African leaders themselves 9 years ago. So the Tana Forum has been around for the last 9 years as probably the premier African forum of African leaders, incumbents, former African leaders, policymakers, thought leaders, civil society, engaged in frank and candid conversations around the very complex peace and security landscapes and challenges that face the continent. And those dialogues are also include collaboration and active participation with our partners, especially the United Nations, with whom we have, and since 2017, together with the United Nations, there was the signing of the AU-UN framework for enhancing our partnership in peace and security, which seeks to harmonize, generally speaking, the complementarity of the UN Agenda 2030 with the African Development Agenda of 2063. So this and other strategic partnerships to urge closer collaboration, regular exchange of information and consultation, and coordinated action on the ground to be able to together address the complex peace and security challenges in Africa are vital and a necessity for the African Union together with the United Nations. But let me come back just a little bit about Tana Forum. This forum was devised and came up with by by African leaders themselves, seeking a platform where we can talk realistically and have a forum by an African-led, an African-owned forum, which comes up with realistic understandings and debate around some of our contexts and challenges, but that give lasting possibility for peace and stability that yet remains open to the world. So I think dialogue as part of the African Union's commitments to operationalizing multilateral actions for peace and development have been long-standing, and the TANA Forum is a very key and pivotal part of that footstool, at least certainly for the last 9 years. But for the architecture, in terms of the African peace and security architecture, as a normative framework, is part of the AU's mandate in promoting peace and security and stability as a primary objective of the African Union. But let me tell you, I think what is important now, as we move forward, everybody seems to be in this very new space of review and resetting, and this extraordinary these extraordinary circumstances that have brought by COVID-19 have somehow also exposed some of the opportunities that we might need to address in terms of some of the contradictions of how we can realistically address some of the challenges in terms of a more participatory global governance framework that really does include all actors in an equitable way, and with the United Nations leading as the global custodian for international action and cooperation in times of peace and in times of war, and certainly in times of crisis as today, to show that multilateralism can work for everyone, everywhere, no matter the time. And this is probably a unique opportunity for us to be able to talk a little bit more about that. And the African Union, obviously, as a key partner of the United Nations and as part of the global community of nations, is certainly doing its part to make sure that multilateralism gets stronger, certainly after this crisis, which is really putting into sharp focus some of the contradictions of our international system, and in our common pursuit for a just and equitable international system. I think we should use this pandemic as a way to reinvigorate our shared commitments to existing international commitments for a global peace and security wherever it may be. Even if it's in the Sahel, we talk about the Sahel, and I will talk about the Sahel and Libya. But whatever's happening in Sahel and Libya is, while it may be geographically in Africa, and it's certainly an African continent, is a threat to global peace and security. And as such, that the United Nations, and as the custodian of global human security in all times, really must, and we hope that it will take up its responsibility to be able to make sure that it does in collaboration with partners like the African Union, so that we together can indeed share these commitments to operationalize and make sure that action is for the good of all, everywhere.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Ashraf, if I can turn back to you, because Ebba raised the interesting topic of what COVID-19 means, and I know that in the ASWAN forum, you had discussions around peacebuilding that were well beyond armed conflict. You were discussing violent extremism, climate issues, and the impact of these challenges to sustaining peace. So. Without putting you too much on the spot, because we're all grappling with COVID-19 and the implications of that, and for other panelists not to relax, I might come back with a similar question to you. But Ashraf, with the experience from the ASWAN forum, where you were touching on or discussing other issues than the sort of standard armed conflict issues, what have you got takeaways for us that could be applied in this context as well? And this time around, I'll ask you to be a little bit shorter, all of you, because we have time for some questions from the audience as well.
Sure. No, thank you. Thank you actually for putting me on the spot. During the last 4 months of lockdown, I actually had the opportunity of reflecting on the lessons that we took out of Aswan. And in a very interesting way, what the COVID-19 does was to actually amplify many of these messages a million times more. The whole idea that that we are dealing with a quantitatively different type of risks, and the need for shifting from managing crisis into managing risks was central to the conversation in Aswan. The second issue that and the answer of Aswan to that was what I talked about in my first intervention: the need to to shift to risk-informed planning, risk-informed policy implementation, and risk-informed budgeting. But another issue that I think the pandemic makes very, very clear is the complexity of the risks that we are dealing with. Over the course of many years, the international community has actually developed what I call one topic threat sensitivities. We need to be conflict sensitive. We need to be climate sensitive. We need to be gender sensitive. And what I would actually like to suggest, as demanding as it might be, is that we probably need to move into a world of complexity sensitivity, that we need to be mindful of not only the relationship between our actions as development actors, as peace and security actors, and as humanitarian actors with the one specific issue that we're dealing with, but rather with the totality of the system. Our interventions do not only affect the peace dynamics, they affect development dynamics, they affect humanitarian dynamics, and hence this would be my call to move from these single threat assessments into something that is more comprehensive, and I think complexity is that. The third point that I would like to make is the notion of integration. It's one that I know that is very close to the heart of Oscar, in particular, having known him for a very long time now. The whole idea that the multidimensional risks that we deal with is evolving in such a way that our policy development and implementation continues to be fragmented. We have silos, peace and security, humanitarian development, and human rights in the UN. We have similar silos, unfortunately, in the African Union. In 2016, and that's why, again, I keep saying that the framework is there, UN organizations and other partners, including, if memory serves me well, the World Bank, adopted the idea of a new way of working, the idea of the need to work across the humanitarian development and peace nexus. And that was an incredibly important step forward. What we need now is to take that nexus a huge step forward, not only from the point of view of the UN and UN agencies and the international financial institutions, but also in the context of national governments. We need to bridge the gap in facing the multidimensional nature of risks to bring to the table actors that have not been involved before.
Thank you very much. I'll give you a chance, Annika, to comment on this. In your first intervention, you commented on the architecture, and I was thinking, architecture, archipelago, and that kind of relates to this not moving away from silos and keeping an integrated system, which I know is what you also spoke to in your first intervention. So if you want.
I think Ashraf is right on the spot that we need to deal with the risks and the complexity. I can reveal that before, when I was still in the government and Sweden joined the United Nations Security Council, it was my dream to make the Security Council have a strategy for global risks. That never happened, but we have the peacebuilding architecture, and the whole idea when it was set up in 2005 was to get rid of the silos, to bridge the notions between peace and security on the one hand and development on the other. And I'm saying that the House is there now because there is a much stronger realization today that you will have no full peace and security without dealing with inequalities, participation of all people in the country, and in addition, the cross-border complexity that is also there. So it's more about reaching out further to see to it that we populate and furbish the House even further, or the framework, as Ashraf said.
Thank you very much. Franck, if I may, as part of your fragility strategy, you are one of your focus areas is sort of is root causes issues, which of course is or could perhaps be a way of getting there, of moving in that direction. So can I ask for your comment on that?
Sure. I mean, addressing the root cause of fragility is extremely important. And that's also how you see the importance of the partnership, because other organizations are bringing some information that are critical in this respect. Clearly, for instance, in terms of partnership, let's be very clear. The UN is bringing the humanitarian expertise, the security expertise, sometimes the presence as well, that is extremely needed for other actors. So when we look about risk assessment, when we look at operationalizing all those commitments on the ground, I want to just reiterate that we are not in a stage of making new commitment. We are moved now where I would say the rubber hits the ground at the country level, and there has been really a scaling up of partnership with other actors in that direction. Now, addressing root cause of fragility, the key drivers, what does that mean for an actor like the World Bank? It means looking at all the different issues that, if they are not addressed, could lead to an escalation of violence. Could be gender inequality, we talk about it. It's not only a question gender of scaling up on gender-based violence. It's a question of promoting women as agent of change. It's recognizing that women have a key role to play in terms of prevention of conflict. And therefore, it's very important to address gender inequality, climate change, super important. That leads to scarcity of resource and a number of potential conflict between communities, as we can see in the Sahel. That also consists in trying to understand better how government countries are sharing resource across the countries and providing services across all the different groups, and to see if there is not a perception of inequality. So all this understanding, it's not in Washington that we are doing it. It's at the country level, with involving other key relevant stakeholders, partners, local, international, to have the base, the foundation to put forward our country partnership framework, our commitment with the financing at the country level. So again, very important shift. What does that mean? It means that it's clearly having a better understanding at the country level of the key drivers of fragility, and trying to see how, from a development perspective, we can tailor our financing to fully work with countries to addressing them. This is very important. In Niger, concrete example, I think it's important to mention a real example. It's about working with strengthening economic opportunity for young people and also for women in part of the countries. And we know that if it's not being done, that could again lead to an escalation of conflict. But what I mentioned in Niger, I could mention to many other countries. So that's what it means, prevention. It's difficult to do. It requires coordination. I was so happy to hear Ashraf mentioning it, because again, all the actors are bringing the local knowledge or the expertise that we don't have. When we talk about election, we talk about security, we talk about humanitarian aspects. This is something that at the bank, it's not our mandate, but we need other actors to have this understanding, to be more granular, and to ensure that our financing are well tailored to the issue that countries are facing, and therefore to be more effective.
Great, thank you very much. So, Oscar, your assessment: are we going to see a global risk strategy coming out from the Security Council? You would probably be charged with working on it, or someone close to you. So, is it a good idea? Well, you can't say anything else now, but is it a good idea? And do you see a role for it?
Thank you. Let me sort of jump on and in again, and just to stress that how much I support this notion and the cruciality of partnerships. One of the ways that the intergovernmental bodies have to be able to push forward agenda of multilateralism is that if the multilateral organizations are actually working together. And for multilateral organizations and member state organizations to do so, it is crucial that we do have cohesion across the different streams of work. The Secretary General has put prevention at the very heart of the reform process in the UN, precisely because in order to be effective multilaterally today, you need a coherence. You need to be able to offer governments and societies a package that integrates the work and complementarity between international financial institutions, the normative work and the support and capacity building that the UN provides to its many streams, and the partnership with regional, sub-regional organizations, the private sector, civil society organizations. This is the increasing talk about inclusive multilateralism. This is not just about government, it's about the multiple partners, a sustaining peace, a prevention lane, and to build back better and stronger. So at the heart of the response, there's the need of coherence. And coherence means literally breaking the silos within the UN between humanitarian, development, human rights, and peace and security actors. It also means breaking the silos among member states in the way that they engage in the Security Council, in ECOSOC, and in the General Assembly, and how member states also engage in regional organizations. Sorry. This is why the issue of financing becomes quite central, because a lot of the fragmentation we see in the world is very much driven by fragmented financing. And here, the call for good donorship of Annika is extremely important. In order to be relevant today in the COVID-19 response, it is absolutely essential that what we have learned from the past responses on prevention, on Ebola response, on HIV response, is that we need to bring into the joint analysis, into the joint programming, into the joint response, a conflict-sensitive lens. We need to bring in a human rights lens. We need to build in a peace-building lens, because otherwise we will miss the opportunity that many governments are going through right now to build back better together. We cannot build back to the same situation we were and ignore fundamental drivers of instability and of conflict. And if these are not addressed today, when COVID-19 is actually exacerbating inequalities, it's exacerbating discrimination, it is actually increasing dramatically the level of absolute poors that the world is going to see as a result of this economic collapse. If we are not focused on drivers as we respond to the humanitarian, the socioeconomic, the health responses, then we might miss this opportunity to build back better together. And in this sense, a crucial element is how we involve communities, how we involve local authorities, and how we empower women and young people. The panel just before this one was focused on the role of young people and on women. These are the first responders, especially in fragile and conflict-affected states, where the state's capacity is in itself extremely weak, and where the response of protection, of saving lives, of building back better, relies on the resilience of the peace building and the resilience of communities. So I take this long road to respond to your question on the Security Council, because unfortunately at this point, there is a need for global leadership. There is a need for global coherence, and there's a need for the different intergovernmental mechanisms to join forces to respond proactively. What is interesting is that since the beginning of April, the Peacebuilding Commission, which we provide a secretariat to as a result of PBSO, has met repeated times to discuss the impact of COVID on peace building and sustaining peace. We've had a focused thematic discussion on health and food insecurity, and Franck was one of the briefers of the Peacebuilding Commission. And here we show the partnership between the UN and the World Bank coming together, how the analytics, how the comparative strengths of the different institutions are coming together to come up with coherent responses. The Peacebuilding Commission met on the situation in West Africa and the Sahel. We've had country-focused specific discussions on Liberia, on the Central African Republic, precisely because COVID is affecting the peace agreement republic. It will affect how the government is able to organize or not elections, how the peacekeeping operation will be able to continue to provide security. So here, I go back to the centrality of the shared and mutual commitment is we need coherence in the intergovernmental fora so that we create platforms of solidarity. The Peacebuilding Commission is a unique platform of solidarity, which brings relevant actors to support peacebuilding priorities of the member states, and they're very contextual and very specific driven. This concept of national ownership is central to what we're discussing. If there's no ownership by by governments and their societies, there is very little peace building that we can do. It comes back to the centrality of political will, of political solutions, and integrating the response so that we're focusing on the vulnerable people. And the last point I would say is that financing is everything. The way financing is structured, how flexible, how risk tolerant, how fast, how catalytic, how we're co-leveraging the financing so that we are addressing the spectrum of issues that prevent relapse into conflict or that accelerate the drivers into conflict. And here we manage a very small instrument, but it's meant to be very catalytic in supporting the partnership, which is the Peacebuilding Fund. And I'm very grateful for all the mentionings in these and very many other sessions before, because financing for peacebuilding is still inadequate, is still unpredictable, and is absolutely not to the level of where it should be. We have, as a result of the reforms and as a result of the proven track record of this Peacebuilding Fund, now have to turn down governments who in the past was easy to respond to. But now the demand that's coming for peace-building financing to address conflict drivers, to address issues of the UN together, but how we leverage the UN coherence to bring other partners. The Burkina Faso Prevention and Peacebuilding Joint Assessment with the World Bank, the EU, the Africa Development Bank, and the UN is a perfect example of these joint initiatives that are required in these very challenging times, because we need clarity in the division of labor, we need unity in action, and we need to support national priorities. We need to involve mechanisms that create inclusivity, because without inclusivity, there's no trust, there's no legitimacy, and there's no peace building. And here, financial instruments and government platforms are key in this discussion as we go forward. Thank you very much, Johannes.
Thank you very much. We've had many discussions, so not least on financing. I'm tempted to jump in on that myself, but I'll stick to being a moderator and not engage on that question. But I see others who might want to come in. But I also want to introduce now the questions that we've had from the audience. So if I could start with you, Ebba. One of the questions that we have received relates to the in the context of the AU, which how to foster what I think you, Oscar, referred to as a sort of a collective ownership in what is fundamentally still and that's not isolated to the AU. That's true in any regional membership-based organization. So how do you foster that, that collective ownership of the challenge of peace building?
Well, I think you got it right in the sense that it's not very particular to the African Union in that sense, in terms of intergovernmental organizations. But in terms of normative structures, I think, the African Union does have what we call the African Peace and Security Architecture, which really embraces a very comprehensive agenda for peace and security in Africa that includes early warning and conflict prevention, peacemaking, peace support operations, peace building and post-conflict reconstruction and development, the promotion of democratic practices, good governance and respect for human rights, and humanitarian action and disaster management. Now, it's important to know that all of this, in terms of the APSA, which the African Peace and Security Architecture, there seems to be many architectures that we're talking about today, was established and conceptualized 10 years ago. And I think we have to really see it within the prism of a world that is changing in terms of peace building and humanitarian interventions, even before the pandemic, especially in Africa, already challenged by emerging new threats, asymmetrical warfare, very mobile, seemingly invisible, but very lethal adversaries. So, I think the African Union has called for a rethink as we move into a new world of very complex risks, as Ashraf so very eloquently put it, of the doctrine that governs the global peacekeeping operations in Africa to better respond to these new threats to global peace and security in their very new forms, which are exacerbated not just by what you call the and in inverted commas, armed conflicts. But, I think we have to think of what you call the drivers, which include climate change, which include poverty, which include fragility and conflict and violence and inequality. So all of those things. The African Union is a 55-member state-driven organization with 55 very different governance and very different developmental and economic and security outlooks. So really, it's probably one of the most complex yet most important intergovernmental voices in the globe right now, certainly where one of the most important theaters where the United Nations is operating in the peace and security and stability areas of work, which is why as we move into this new world, it really is incumbent for greater political will at the highest level of global leadership, which for us would be the United Nations Security Council. And not to bring the elephant in the room, but really we cannot have a United Nations Security Council that is supposed to advocate and adjudicate on behalf of the global community and exclude Africa out of that equation. And as our world moves, when we talk about Burkina Faso or the Sahel, anywhere on the continent, all of these drivers, all of these conflicts, no matter how they manifest themselves, have a follow-on effect on our common global peace and security in its very many complex risk factors. So again, I think having a very important idea of the inclusivity, the true inclusivity of the voices where these things are occurring, and understanding that without that ownership at the highest level of international decision-making, we cannot truly talk about shared commitments to operationalize action for our common and global peace and development, especially in this time where really right now international solidarity is no longer the language of sympathy or the rhetoric of holding hands. It really has almost become a revolutionary idea born out of a shared vulnerability to confront a common threat that where there's well-being in one part of the world does not protect any of us at any one time. So again, it really does come to global leadership in maintaining the existing international commitments that we have made for our world, whether it be climate change, whether it be peace, security, stability, no matter where it is, in Syria, in the Sahel, or whether it is in Benin or Central African Republic, it's the same world. And that global leadership, the United Nations has to be able to do it together with Africa.
That's very true. We certainly agree. This crisis and many crises before this, but this crisis maybe more than what we've seen before, illustrates how integrated and dependent we are on each other. And I made the point that the question was on the AU, but it's true on any intergovernmental cooperation that of course it poses challenges. And we are running out of time, or actually I think we have ran out of time, and I've been given some extra minutes, which we have then used, and so we're now into the extra minutes. So I want to give you the final chance, Annika, because you're also in the same room, on the review, and on the possible. And this is a question from the audience or from listeners. On the possibilities to use the review also to rally this global political support that Ebba was also referring to, the necessity of that. If you see what opportunities you see, it's a challenging task, but
well, the global support for peace building in so many situations is a necessity, and we'll need multilateralism and cooperation more than ever if we are to come back stronger together. So those of us that actually do not believe in isolationism but in working together, we need to advocate that very strongly. And as I said, the House is there, and it would be rather easy, I believe, to have more of what Ashraf spoke about, namely combining the national ownership with national responsibility, like Liberia, like Burkina Faso, like many other countries that understand that it's a good thing to work with the peace-building architecture to actually provide peace to their countries and their neighborhood. And then I think you misunderstood what I said about the United Nations Security Council and risk. I don't think that will happen. I'm disappointed that they cannot even agree on a support to the Secretary General's call for ceasefire. But I see the Peacebuilding Commission, the PBSO in the DPPA, the department in the UN, and the Peacebuilding Fund as very important instruments for dealing with risk. And the Burkina Faso case, again, is how prevention and risk analysis is almost the same thing if you do it in the right way. So I see a lot of potential, and we need to work together. And our call for good peace-building donorship is there, and very serious, because if we orphan countries in fragile situations, it will affect their people tremendously badly, but also the entire world, bearing in mind all the risks that we have to deal with.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all. That's hopeful last words. And thank you to all our panelists and to indeed to the audience, to the many questions that have come in. There were, of course, many others. There will be, this conversation continues, not with exactly the same panelists, but the week or the forum continues. There will be a panel on Monday on who are the new peace-building actors and what do they do. That starts at 3 o'clock on Monday. I think that's building on the same conversation. Again, just to say, you raised it, you know how difficult it is to organize a forum. So I agree with you that it's indeed been fantastic that that you've been able to organize on short time and in this digital version. And thank you all so much for participating, both here in the panel and as participants and listeners, because it's so important that we continue this discussion. Thank you very much.